Hello, I'm Monica Reinagel, host of the Nutrition Diva podcast. Summer is here, and with it, the hot and sticky weather. A morning working in the garden or maybe on the golf course can leave you more depleted than you realize, and plain water isn't always the most efficient way to restore the balance. That's where Liquid IV comes in. Its science-backed formula is clinically proven to hydrate faster than water alone. Whether you're exercising, playing outside, or simply surviving a summer heat wave, it's an easy way to stay hydrated. Shop now at liquidiv.com. Liquid IV, hydration that goes wherever life takes you.
Because like I've mentioned before, I always thought ADHD primarily as a learning, like a hindrance to learning or a potential challenge to learning. The inattentiveness, I always thought like, wow, or, my son, having a high risk tolerance and he's kind of impulsive. All of those things I kind of expected with the diagnosis. The emotional regulation actually, as I've learned more about it and realizing how it's a core component of ADHD, continues to surprise me sometimes how intertwined they are, right? But I think it's because on paper, it's so easy just to look at the behavior, right? You look at the behavior and you say like it's willful defiance. There's some level of choice, right? To, how a kid is acting or misbehaving. And to the contrary, it's a skills gap. It's, and then coupled with, I guess the emotional dysregulation coupled with, the impulsivity that can make for, very like split second decisions where the brain's not really thinking, right?
Welcome back to the Neurodiversity Voices Podcast. Today's conversation is a deeply personal and important one about ADHD, emotional dysregulation, school discipline, special education, and what can happen when neurodivergent children are misunderstood by the systems meant to support them. My guest today is Grace Lee, a mother and advocate whose family went through a painful experience after her son, who has ADHD and an IEP, began struggling with escalating behavior at school. What Grace first understood as a need for more support was too often viewed through a punitive lens. Eventually, one school incident escalated into law enforcement involvement and juvenile charges. Even though a later manifestation determination review found that her son's behavior was directly connected to his disability. In this episode, Grace shares how that experience changed her understanding of ADHD, special education law, behavior intervention plans, documentation, advocacy, and the gap between educational protections and the juvenile justice system. We talk about why emotional dysregulation is so often mistaken for intentional misbehavior, why adults need to recognize signs of nervous system crisis, and why schools must move from punishment toward curiosity, de-escalation, support, and partnership with families. Grace also shares what she has learned as a parent advocate, from the importance of documenting everything to finding community, using technology as an advocacy tool, and continuing to push for change even when the process is exhausting. This is a conversation about one family's story, but it points to a much larger issue: how we respond to neurodivergent children when they are struggling. My hope is that this episode encourages educators, administrators, policymakers, first responders, parents, and communities to ask a different question. Not simply, what did this child do wrong. But what is this child trying to communicate, and what support do they need? Here is my conversation with Grace Lee. Grace, thank you so much for joining me today.
Hi, absolutely. Thanks for having me.
Let's begin with your family story because understanding your journey helps set the stage for everything that followed. Grace, could you introduce yourself and share your family's journey that led you to become an advocate for neurodivergent children and educational reform?
Of course, yeah. This is a story that is extremely personal to me. I'm a mom to a lovely, rambunctious, now 11-year-old son who has ADHD. I always thought that ADHD was primarily inattentiveness, inability to sit still. I never really thought of it through the lens of behavior. That really all changed, I would say, in about the last year and a half. My son and I had a very tough year at school, and all of the things that happened during the academic year led me to where I am today. So my son has had a documented disability, ADHD, and has an IEP and documentation on campus. But I actually didn't realize that part of the individualized education piece of things could also be requesting behavioral supports. So once I started noticing some behavior changes, particularly happening on campus, I started asking for behavioral supports in January. I actually started noticing behavior changes even prior to that, but we had a specific incident that gave me enough leverage to ask for additional support. Unfortunately, the school district, there were a ton of delays in getting my son any interventions. And unfortunately, I consider it to be kind of an emotional collapse when we had a really hard adjustment coming back from spring break. There was an incident. I guess the incident consisted of my son making physical contact with the school administrator. And unfortunately, the school administrator decided to press criminal charges against my son. Although we had a manifestation determination review that later deemed his behavior to be a direct manifestation of his disability. And after learning much later on that there's this disconnect between special education law and criminal juvenile law, it really galvanized me, noticing that there are some really big gaps in the system. And unfortunately, it was a big learning experience, but also quite a painful experience.
Before this experience, what was your understanding of ADHD, special education supports, and the protections schools are supposed to provide? And how did that understanding change?
Dramatically, so dramatically. Like I said, I thought the IEP, the Individualized Education Plan, was primarily there for academic support. And that's how I had kind of utilized it to say, does my son need to get pulled from class? Does he need more individualized attention? How can he get that? What supports does he need? To excel academically during testing season? Are there extra things that we could do to help support him? And it wasn't until a friend of mine actually mentioned that there's something called a behavior intervention plan. She said, you can add a BIP to your kid's IEP. And I said, what the heck is a BIP? It's a lot of these acronyms and this verbiage that gets thrown at you. If you don't know it, you don't know what to ask for necessarily, right? So I always thought of the ADHD supports, again, more within the context of academic support specifically. But I realized, just from my experience, but also I guess having to work with and within the confines of like the district and what questions I needed to ask for, and then also advocating for my son, realizing that behavior supports are actually a big piece of what you can ask for and what you should be asking for.
What first concerned you as a parent?
I would say it's two primary, or maybe more than two, but a couple of things, right? The first was I feel like the school district and I were both seeing behavior escalations, but the way we interpreted that data was completely different. I was seeing those escalations and thinking like, wow, my kid is crying out for help. He needs support. What types of interventions does he need? Because what I noticed was a lot of his behavior issues we were experiencing at school, he's not like this at home. So it also made me think like, is there something happening at school? Are there certain triggers at school? Is it environmental? What's going on? Whereas I felt like the school administrators were primarily looking at this through a punitive lens of saying, he's acting out, he's being defiant, he needs to be punished. And so I think that kind of stands out to me. And another thing that was quite upsetting is that I really wanted to be a collaborative, equal partner in the process. The way I imagine an ARD process to go is that, we get together collaboratively and say, okay, what are we doing at school? What supports are working? What did we do last year? Is this working better? Is it worse? What is mom doing at home? Right? But I think it started to feel really lonely and it started to get a bit adversarial because I felt like I wasn't getting a timely response, if any response, from administrators and teachers at the campus level, but also at the school district level. And yeah, I just think I feel like I hit a wall because ultimately my hope is that the end goal would have been to provide as much support as we could for my son so that he could have a positive experience where socially, behaviorally, he's thriving, but also in an environment where, he's at school, you would expect them to be able to learn.
Join me, Monica Reinagel, for a live taping of the Nutrition Diva podcast in Washington, D.C. On Wednesday, August 19th, we are gathering at the beautiful Friends of the National Arboretum to dive into the science of hydration. We're kicking the evening off with a sunset yoga session, followed by the live podcast recording and an open Q&A. So bring your most burning nutrition and hydration questions. Come for the yoga, come for the show, or do both. A huge thanks to our friends at Liquid IV for making this night possible and keeping us hydrated all evening long. Spots are limited. Grab yours and RSVP now at nutritiondivadc.com.
From athletic stuff like a full court pickup game, swish, to athletic-ish stuff like a half-mile stroll. Get those steps in. Head to Sierra or Sierra.com for the brands you want at the prices that let you do it all. From athletic to athletic-ish, Sierra's got it.
What were you seeing at home that differed from what the school was reporting?
Yeah, I was seeing a lot more regulation, just in general. Like, of course, he would have bad days or days where he would be a bit more agitated or more easy to kind of have, I guess, more of an emotional response. I was definitely seeing that at home, but not nearly as often or not with as much intensity. Then, because at one point, with my son, his behavior, like incident referrals, he was averaging one incident a week when he was at school prior to spring break, and, that frequency, that intensity, is not at all what I was seeing at home. And even when I would have these conversations with my son, when I was correcting him or saying like, hey, right now we can't do X, Y, or Z, I would say more often than not, he was receptive to that feedback, even if he didn't always like it or appreciate it, or it wasn't the outcome that he wanted. Whereas in the school setting, it seems like his default response was very much on edge.
At what point did you realize this was becoming something much bigger?
Man. Yeah, like I said, I started noticing behavior changes and challenges as early as September of 2025. And then my son had a physical altercation with another classmate in January, right? So at that point, I was honestly scared because my son put his hands on another kid. Although my son was instigated, the actual physical component, I would say, I would say my son kind of started the process, even though I feel like his friend was taunting him and egging him on to the point where, my son had a very physically aggressive response. I started getting very concerned at that point, because I don't want him to hurt himself. I didn't want him to harm himself. I didn't want him to harm other kids. And so even though there were instances where I was noticing behavior changes and challenges, I think that was the incident that really caught my attention. And that's what prompted me to ask for the behavior intervention plan. Mm-hmm.
Your family's experience highlights something many people still misunderstand about ADHD. Let's talk about that. Your son's experience highlighted something many people don't fully understand about ADHD.
Mm-hmm.
What would you want listeners to know about emotional dysregulation and why it's so often mistaken for intentional misbehavior?
Yeah, I think that even for me, honestly, I think it really surprised me. Because like I've mentioned before, I always thought ADHD primarily as a learning, like a hindrance to learning or a potential challenge to learning. The inattentiveness, I always thought like, wow, or, my son, having a high risk tolerance and he's kind of impulsive. All of those things I kind of expected with the diagnosis. The emotional regulation actually, as I've learned more about it and realizing how it's a core component of ADHD, continues to surprise me sometimes how intertwined they are, right? But I think it's because on paper, it's so easy just to look at the behavior, right? You look at the behavior and you say like it's willful defiance. There's some level of choice, right? To, how a kid is acting or misbehaving. And to the contrary, it's a skills gap. It's, and then coupled with, I guess the emotional dysregulation coupled with, the impulsivity that can make for, very like split second decisions where the brain's not really thinking, right? And I always tell my son, like, let's practice trying to give ourselves at least, 30 seconds, just enough of a break before we act so our thinking brain can come back online. And I think even for neurotypical folks and even for adults, that's really hard to do, right? So I think it is a skill that needs to be built up. But it's something that I think the ADHD brains are not really wired for. So it takes a lot more, right? And yeah, if you don't have a parent or a teacher or a school administrator that wants to get down to the why, is it environment? Is there a trigger? And honestly, again, is it as simple as saying, did he sleep well last night? Right? Like all of those things can have these downstream effects. Because if you don't have anybody asking those questions, I think it's very easy to label neurodivergent kids, as, misbehaving and defiant.
During your advocacy, you've spoken about recognizing a nervous system crisis rather than simply labeling a child as defiant. How do you distinguish between the two, and why is that distinction so important?
Yeah, I would say in a general sense, I think most of us, and I'm specifically thinking of myself as a parent, right? You can kind of tell when your kid's having a bad day or seems to be getting a little agitated more quickly, right? You can kind of sense these mannerisms or just their mood, because I feel like it's not just you having sort of the emotional dysregulation. There is the autonomic physiological component of things too, right? All kind of at play at the same time. And one of the things that I find really heartbreaking about the day of the incident, as I call it, where my son had this physical contact with the school administrator, that kind of breaks my heart. Sorry. As I think about it, is that the administrator decided to call 911, not because she was injured, but because there was no school nurse that day. My son was literally vomiting. He was so distressed. He was in such a state of physical distress. He was vomiting, and they needed to call 911 to make sure that he was stable, right? Did they need to transport him? Did he need to go to the hospital? And unfortunately, nobody at the school informed me that they had called EMS. I actually heard from my son later that day. He said, "Hey, Oma, I saw, my friend's dad at school today." And I said, "Well, that's really weird. Today would be a very odd, day for you to see your friend's dad at school." And he said, "Well, it's because my friend's dad is a firefighter." And he said he took my blood pressure. They pulled out a stretcher for me in case I needed it, but I didn't. And he said they helped calm me down and they left. And so to me, to this day, clearly, I think about it and my heart breaks for my son. Because clearly, if you take his behavior and you add in the context of having to call 911, right? And having, these firefighters and emergency services come out to the scene, to me, it's so clear.
Join me, Monica Reinagel, for a live taping of the Nutrition Diva podcast in Washington, D.C. On Wednesday, August 19th, we are gathering at the beautiful Friends of the National Arboretum to dive into the science of hydration. We're kicking the evening off with a sunset yoga session, followed by the live podcast recording and an open Q&A. So bring your most burning nutrition and hydration questions. Come for the yoga, come for the show, or do both. A huge thanks to our friends at Liquid IV for making this night possible and keeping us hydrated all evening long. Spots are limited. Grab yours and RSVP now at nutritiondivadc.com.
More people, more devices, more AI. The way we live today takes a lot of energy. Wind and solar are powerful, but not always available. That's where natural gas comes in, with reliable energy whenever it's needed. Companies like Energy Transfer work behind the scenes, safely transporting these resources to facilities across the country through a network of underground pipelines. Learn more at ittakesenergy.com.
He's in a state of crisis, right? So it's not just the behavior or the emotional dysregulation piece of things, but his body was literally in this fight or flight mode, right? So, I think not only, did we have a manifestation determination review, the MDR, find that my son's behavior was directly related, or, there was a direct manifestation between his disability and the incident. But you couple that with the fact that he was in a state of physiological crisis. It's very frustrating. It's very frustrating how a person, and especially a school teacher and an administrator who, they're there to nurture and teach, mentor children, would take that extra step of filing criminal charges, against my son.
What signs should adults recognize?
I would say just general signs of agitation. I don't know if that's specific enough, but also Sometimes the behavior maybe is a bit more subtle. Sometimes it's a bit more obvious. But again, as a parent or even as a teacher, if you're teaching or interacting with a kid day to day, I think you kind of notice, okay, today he's sort of having a better day. His mood seems, or she, doesn't always have to be a he, but you can sort of notice those little signs. And also, let's say, for instance, even for me, if my son's like, hey, I really want to go and, get ice cream today. Most of the time, if I say, hey, bud, maybe not today, that's something that, we can do tomorrow or during the weekend. And he tends to be okay with that feedback. But there may be some days where I give him the exact same response, but his reaction to my response seems a lot bigger, right? Then I kind of sit with that. And the thing is, I'm not perfect. There are days where I snap at my son to be like, be grateful. I said I was still getting you ice cream. It's just not going to be right now. But I think part of it, honestly, is also that adults don't always have the capacity to have patience for their kids, right? If we're being honest. But I think it's always kind of looking for some of those not so obvious signs. And I would say for me, a lot of times it's just more agitation than normal. And then, I would say for my son, I think sleep is huge. Again, something completely, underrated, right? And so I definitely notice a shift in his behavior. If he stayed up later, if he hasn't gotten as much sleep. And I honestly, I don't know if I want to say sometimes you just know it's those little signs that you can pick up on. But yeah, no, definitely if you're noticing anything kind of big or small, I think, again, going back to maybe unpacking that and asking why or what may be the underlying reason is helpful.
Understanding emotional dysregulation is one thing. Unfortunately, your family's experience also showed what can happen when systems fail to recognize it. One of the most difficult parts of your story is how quickly a school disciplinary incident escalated into involvement with law enforcement and the juvenile justice system. What does that reveal about the systems currently in place for neurodivergent children?
Yeah. Again, this has all kind of been a huge learning curve for me, right? So first it was actually recognizing that, that the criminal, the juvenile justice system and special education law do not intersect. So even though we had that MDR outcome, that really had no bearing on, my son's criminal charges. So I think it's that. And also I was kind of surprised, that an administrator or a school district isn't required. It's particularly for kids that have documented disabilities and paperwork. Although with that in mind, I think that opens up potentially a whole new question for kids that maybe don't have a diagnosis or have a diagnosis, but not the proper documentation. My son, even with an IEP, we experienced what we did. My heart breaks for those families that don't even have that. My son had a layer of protection that should have protected him, but even that didn't stop the process, right? But yeah, I was actually very shocked that, that there wasn't a requirement or something to say, hey, for kids that have documented disabilities, if you have a student that has an IEP, maybe there needs to be a 72-hour waiting period, so that we can hold an MDR, go through the process before criminal charges were filed. Because the thing that, absolutely flipped everything upside down for us is that the criminal charges were filed about a week prior to our MDR. So by that point, even though we had come to the conclusion that my son's behavior was disability related, unless the school district wanted to go out on a limb and work with the county attorney's office, we were kind of left on our own to handle the criminal side of things.
You use the phrase, quote, structural pipeline, quote, when describing what happened. Can you explain what that means and why you believe so many neurodivergent children are vulnerable to entering that pipeline?
Yeah. I mean, the school to prison pipeline is something that I had heard, or the terminology was familiar to me. Never once, did I think that we would personally be navigating it, right? But I think it really goes back to the fundamental misunderstanding of, I'm going to put this in quotes, like behavior when it comes to kids with neurodivergence. And, I have a bit of an anecdote that I thought was really interesting. My son and I went for our juvenile intake session about a month after the incident. And the probation officer basically comes in, interviews you. And at one point, my son needed to take an assessment on a computer by himself. So the officer and I stepped out into the hallway to give him some privacy. And so I was talking to the officer and I asked him, do you have any idea, just even a broad sense of how many kids that come through these doors? Do you have a sense of how many of them are either neurodivergent, or have trauma in their lives, or honestly, probably both, right? And his response, maybe it didn't surprise me, but it was still kind of, it just showed how structurally again, it's problematic and this misunderstanding of what it means to be neurodivergent. But he said, we don't really see ADHD as a disability. And I was like, okay. And he basically told me, your situation is an outlier because, your son has an IEP, you have the MDR. And he said, because you're actively going to counseling and your son takes medication. He said those four things kind of, make us view ADHD as more of a medical thing than we otherwise would. Right. So his behavior we would view through a slightly different lens. But he said for a normal kid, for an average kid that comes in here and says they have ADHD, he's like, we don't even really consider it. Right. If that doesn't show, kind of the fundamental mismatch, I don't really know what does. Right.
Looking back, what do you believe schools could have done differently before the situation reached a crisis point?
I'll start off by saying I know teachers, administrators, and school districts are underfunded, underappreciated, underpaid, and overworked, right? I know the resource part is really hard. But I really wish, I wish this for everybody, but as I'm looking back on our experience, I really wish they would have seen me as a partner and an ally, right? Where we could collaboratively work on the ARD process together. Again, with the end goal of making school accessible for my son, but honestly for other kids. I think when you have mechanisms in place to help one student, inadvertently, I think that ends up helping other kids too, right? And so I think that's part of it where, had interventions been in place prior, or at least we had started having those conversations prior. And I actually said this on the day of the incident. I have no idea if the interventions had been in place when I requested them back in January. I can't prove with 100% certainty that the March incident would have never happened, right? But that's a question that kind of bothers me, I think, a little bit to this day. Like, I wonder how different things would have been if we would have started helping sooner, right? If we had started implementing interventions like in January or even in February. But yeah, no, I really wish the school district would have seen me as a partner and as an ally where we were working towards the same goal. And then I think going back to kind of the irony, whereas I'm talking to my son and telling him, hey, we need to use our rational thinking brain. Let's not lead with emotion first. I almost feel like the school administrator led with her emotions before maybe sitting with the gravity of what pressing criminal charges, what that could mean for our family, what that could mean for my son. And naively, I did not realize before experiencing this naively. So I didn't realize that your criminal record is completely separate from criminal charges. So although my son's charges were later dismissed, his criminal record, although sealed, they're not going to be available to the general public. There may be instances down the line in the future where he may have to explain why he has a criminal record, right? And the fact that that happened when my son was 10, I kind of imagining what that might be for him at the age of 18 or 25 or 27. That is also another area where I feel very betrayed by the school, right? It may not impact his day-to-day life, but nonetheless, this one day will continue to have lingering consequences for him potentially, right? But yeah, I just think schools and parents could actually be so much stronger if we could work together. And I think that was my biggest disappointment coming out of this entire experience.
Join me, Monica Reinagel, for a live taping of the Nutrition Diva podcast in Washington, D.C. On Wednesday, August 19th, we are gathering at the beautiful Friends of the National Arboretum to dive into the science of hydration. We're kicking the evening off with the sunset yoga session, followed by the live podcast recording and an open Q&A. So bring your most burning nutrition and hydration questions. Come for the yoga, come for the show, or do both. A huge thanks to our friends at Liquid IV for making this night possible and keeping us hydrated all evening long. Spots are limited. Grab yours and RSVP now at nutritiondivadc.com.
McDonald's is putting value back on the menu. Whether you're craving a Big Mac, McNuggets, or sausage, egg, and cheese McGriddles, make it a meal and save. Your favorite is now your wallet's favorite, too. Extra value meals are back.
Grab an epic meal for easy money. 10-piece McNuggets or Filet-O-Fish served with medium fries and a medium Coke. All for just $8. Price and participation may vary. Promotion pricing may be lower than meal pricing. Ba-da-ba-ba-ba.
There's a fire inside you can't ignore. Stand still? Not a chance. You're a lifelong learner who's come this far. Now, we're here to help you keep going further. Capella University. What can't you do? Visit capella.edu to learn more.
What role should de-escalation play?
A much bigger role. Absolutely. Because even though the administrator that day, and then I think also the 2 PE coaches that they had on my son's campus, technically it sounds like there is some de-escalation protocols and training that they receive. I think in the moment, I don't think that information is as easy to access. And I also think there's a perception bias. When you have a kid who, if you've labeled a kid as defiant and disrespectful, I think whether you realize it or not, you probably have some implicit bias against how you interact with them too. So even if you have all of the tools in your toolbox to say, I know how to de-escalate in situations, I don't think very many of the de-escalation protocols, if any of them were followed. But to me, my perception is that I think they had some underlying sort of bias again towards my son to say, this is the kind of kid he is. And so I think maybe even the tone of voice they were using with him, and how they were interacting with him, I think continued to lead to more of an emotional response instead of help calming him down. Right? Because the nervous system regulation piece is what he's missing in that moment, right?
What concerns you most about how schools currently respond?
Oh, man. I So I don't think I mentioned where we were located. We have since moved, but all of this was happening when we lived in Texas. And the state of Texas has seen a pretty big increase. I don't know the exact statistics, but a pretty big increase in school districts having their own law enforcement presence, right? And for me, there may be some real world implications where it makes sense, where you have a big safety consideration or school shootings and things where you could make the case for law enforcement. But I think that honestly disproportionately impacts kids for minor offenses or kids with neurodivergence to end up in that structural pipeline, right? So, I mean, personally for me, I think I would want to see less law enforcement in schools. And then also just in a general sense, whether you want to have a law enforcement presence on campus or not, I think there needs to be a big overhaul in how people understand neurodivergence. During the MDR meeting, my son's principal actually told me, I didn't realize that a core part of ADHD is this level of emotional dysregulation. Right? She said, the way that your son acted and the level of physical aggression he exhibited, she said, I would think that I would only see that with a student that had a diagnosis of oppositional defiance disorder. And she was like, considering that your son doesn't have an ODD diagnosis in addition to ADHD, she was like, I would have never expected this kind of behavior to come from a student. And again, as I am, learning more about ADHD and behavior and emotional regulation myself, I think I may have said the same thing 2 years ago, right? But again, I just think a lot of like ADHD resources and education, even for administrators and educators who have been doing this for decades, I think a lot of that information is quite outdated. So I think an overhaul, retraining, and just I think getting people to understand what it actually means, what the neurodivergent actually does. Where does it struggle? What is neurodivergence? What is actually ADHD, right? And then I think I'll kind of leave it at that.
Although this experience was incredibly difficult, it also transformed you into an advocate. Let's talk about what you've learned. Throughout this experience, you've immersed yourself in special education law, disability rights, and advocacy. What were some of the biggest lessons you learned, and what advice would you give to parents navigating these systems?
Yeah, absolutely. I think one of the most basic things that I learned, and again, some of these lessons I learned the hard way, unfortunately, when I first requested the behavior intervention plan for my son, that was done verbally over the phone. And I can't say that's one of the biggest regrets I have to this day, but now that I know that documentation is everything, right? So pretty much I'm not going to simplify it and say that, if you didn't document it, if you didn't, provide it in writing over email, it's almost like it never happened. It's not quite that black and white. But I would say really the very formal way to do things and the way, where you can start to create a paper trail from day one is by starting the documentation process from the very beginning. It's not something that I myself did. But as I've been through the process, it's something that I've learned. The second unfortunate thing is that schools and districts purposefully gatekeep a lot of information, right? Because again, teachers are overworked, in many instances, probably underpaid, under-resourced. And so I think in a lot of ways, it's just easier to keep parents in the dark instead of having to provide resources and implement interventions for students that have higher levels of need. And so I don't know that many districts or many schools are going to be forthcoming with like, this is how you request an IEP. This is, how you request a BIP. This is, what a functional behavior assessment is. All of this was new to me too. And so, I think the internet and social media can be a good thing and a bad thing, but if you can leverage it in the ways where there's so much information at our fingertips, right? The internet, search engine, Google, social media. I personally follow a lot of advocacy social media accounts that can help break down very heavy and dense special education language in a way that's digestible and understandable, right? So I think that helps too. We have a lot of resources that are out there, but again, the very same resource that is out there that can be really helpful can also feel really overwhelming because there's so much of it. But yeah, I think it's arming ourselves with the knowledge that we need, that we can find, because we might not always get it from the direct source. And yeah, I think building out like in-person community with other parents whose kids also have, who are either also neurodivergent or have other sort of like IEPs and other disabilities, kind of getting together and creating community in that way. And then also recognizing that this advocacy work inevitably does lead to burnout. I have been there. I think like all parents or advocates who have done this for their kids or other students, inevitably will get to a point where it feels very overwhelming and you feel burned out. And recognizing that we are also people who have needs and like we need to rest, right? That may be easier said than done, but in order to continue advocating, right, we need to take some of those breaks. We need to rest when we need to, so that we could wake up the following day to do it all over again.
You've connected with many families and advocates. What patterns are you seeing, and why do you believe that your family's experience reflects a much larger issue?
Yeah, absolutely. I don't know that I have connected to any families personally that have been in the exact same situation as me and my son. However, that being said, I have connected not only with other like advocates and parents online, but a few parents whose kids are still actually enrolled in my son's old district, where it seems like for kids that tend to have more like behavioral challenges, that the district uses, I guess, very punitive measures in how they handle these students, right? So I've had a friend of mine who her son has been excluded, secluded, and physically restrained, right? So like, and I don't know if there may be a time and a place for things like, physical restraint, depending on like what the level of aggression looks like, if the safety of other administrators and teachers and students are involved. But I think regardless of that, that should never be your first go-to, right? There should be other protocols and de-escalation protocols in place before you even get there. And I think there is a pattern of, I think, neurodivergent kids or students, particularly those that have more of the behavioral challenges, tend to get very, they have a very punitive approach to how they approach those students, the number of suspensions, the number of punishments, referrals, incident reports, that kind of thing seems very, very common. And again, going back to curiosity, right? I feel like, few to no people are asking like, wow, this student is behaving this way. Maybe we want to sit with the question to find out why, right?
Why is documentation so important?
Oh my goodness. It is absolutely important because, I think overall having a paper trail is always, like you keep it for your own records, right? And for parents that want to take, any advocacy action, right? Because, for me, I also filed a few state level complaints. If you want to do anything like in a formal capacity like that, the more documentation you have, the better, right? And so, yeah. And again, I think in this day and age, because we have email where you have timestamps and you basically, can easily build up a like digital file of documents and emails. I just think it comes in really handy. What you want to do with that eventually will depend on entirely on the family. But in my instance, I filed 6 different complaints over 4 federal agencies, right? Not all of those complaints have been finalized. But I think, my robust documentation always gives me a peace of mind, because I feel like regardless of what the outcome is, for me, I feel confident that I've established a strong case for myself, because I'm also showing that not only am I, collecting data points and proof, right, that I could later take, but it's also showing that I have been proactive, I think, is the other piece of things too.
How did community help you?
A lot. Yeah. I mean, friends, other parents of neurodivergent kids, online community, I think, have really gotten us through some very, very dark and trying times. Kind of on the flip side of that, my son and even myself, we've actually lost a lot of friends, right? I think some of my mom friends likely will see my son's behavior, and particularly because his behavior started to escalate, right? I think there were some parents that saw me and said, your kid wouldn't be acting that way if you disciplined him better, right? So I think there were some parents that kind of looked, at it as being a discipline issue. And my son also lost quite a few friends too. And like all of my friends know who they are, right? But for all of my friends and my son's friends, that were able to see beyond the behavior, right? I'm to this day, I think I will forever be grateful for those friends. Because I think they recognized his behavior does not define him, right? Regardless of what that behavior is, he is not defined by that. And then going back to some of the, like online advocacy that I've done, I think finding community, because there are times where, this whole process can feel very isolating, right? Am I the only person going through this? And then, very quickly, going online and just being on Instagram, I think you realize that this is much, much more common.
How has technology helped you become a stronger advocate?
Yes, I would say kind of in 2 ways, right? 2-pronged. The first, I would say, again, caveat, I know that AI is not perfect and it can be problematic in its own way. But because there's so much information out there, what I ended up doing is plugging in a lot of data into an AI chatbot and then kind of helping it break it down for me in chunks so that I could understand it, right? And say, for instance, I was like, I don't have an attorney. I am not an attorney. How do I understand how to file a complaint? How do I do it in a way where my points will be the most compelling? What, is an investigator looking for, right? And I will say that the special education complaint that I filed with the Texas Education Agency, both of my complaints came back as unsubstantiated. So they were in essence telling me that the district did what they needed to do. And so, I don't want to make it seem like, hey, you do this one thing and that's the end all be all. I think it is kind of an ongoing process. But definitely leveraging the technology where you can, because the information is there. But sometimes the difference or that chasm between having the information and then being able to do something with the information, right, it can feel really intimidating. And I guess the other piece of that, going back to social media, is that, like, connect with other like-minded people. And then there are also just, free resources out there. I mean, obviously also like, resources that you can pay for, but also just in a general sense, I think, you have a lot of advocates that can provide a lot of information online for free. So yeah, I guess being able to kind of bring all of that together and use it to your advantage. And I will say this, the school district, ended up hiring a law firm, after I filed my 6th complaint. And for a moment, it felt very overwhelming, right? Like I felt like I had a bit of a target on my back, but I also had this moment of like, I'm doing something right. If I wasn't agitating the system, if I wasn't disrupting their status quo day-to-day operations, why would they feel the need to hire a law firm? And so, yeah, I mean, have I done everything and have I had the absolute perfect ideal outcome in every instance? No, but I'm also not letting that stop me. Yeah.
As difficult as this journey has been, you've also become someone working toward meaningful change.
Yes.
Let's finish by looking ahead. If you had the opportunity to redesign the system, what reforms would you prioritize to better support neurodivergent students while also equipping educators and schools?
Yeah, I mean, I think I kind of touched on all of these in previous questions, but if I needed to summarize all of them together, I think in most instances, it is not necessary to have a law enforcement presence on school campuses, right? Again, there may be exceptions to that, but for me on a personal level, I would say that I think we would maybe be better off with no or at least limited like school district law enforcement. And if we were to continue to have a law enforcement presence, I think they need to have extensive training on how to work with kids, and particularly kids with different temperaments and neurodivergence, right? I think they need core training to understand that. And then also thinking at the principal's comment about, oh, I can't believe your son acted in this way when he doesn't have an ODD diagnosis. So I would say that training honestly needs to be district wide. Every single teacher, every counselor, every administrator, everyone at the district, I think. And again, as I'm sitting here, this would be ideal scenario if there were no time and money constraints, right? Because I also understand that this is sort of me dreaming my wild dreams, but there's also the reality of the day-to-day operations, right? And what that looks like. And then, and this would be more of a policy level, right? Not really at the school district necessarily, either state or federal level, where I really think there should be a waiting period of at least, 2 days or 3 days. So 48 to 72 hours, particularly for kids that have documented disabilities, before an administrator or a teacher or whoever at the school can file criminal charges against a minor, right? Because again, I don't know. I think in those 2 or 3 days, that cooling off period could provide more perspective. So yeah, I think those would be my primary 3 things.
This journey has been incredibly challenging, but you've also spoken about finding strength through community and advocacy. What has sustained you throughout this experience, and what continues to give you hope?
Yeah, I have met some amazing people along the way. And also people who have reiterated that our story is worth telling, right? And I mean, I think even coming on a podcast like yours today continues to give me hope because it's giving me a platform, and perhaps it's a little cliche or cheesy to say that, I am on here and I'm talking about our story because I never want this to happen to another family again. But I mean, there's a lot of truth behind that, right? If I can continue to highlight what we went through so that it brings more knowledge and awareness about what happened, what can happen, but also what resources are out there and what other families can do to start the advocacy process even before I did, right? To maybe, prevent this from happening as well. Yeah, but I think a big part of it is also like my in-person but online communities, and connecting a lot of times with other parents that have neurodivergent kids and sharing stories, because I'm finding that there are a lot more similarities than there are differences.
Finally, if educators, school administrators, policymakers, first responders, and parents each remembered just one message from today's conversation, what would you want that message to be?
Yeah. That genuine connection with kids and particularly neurodivergent kids is a game changer, right? Is an absolute game changer. And then kind of connected to that again is I know it's really hard if you're just looking at the kids through the lens of their behavior. But if you could get curious, right? Instead of just seeing the behavior as a standalone, get curious and ask why. Is there a trigger? Is it environmental, So yeah.
Let's have a lightning round. One word that describes advocacy.
Tenacity.
Biggest misconception about ADHD.
Inattentiveness.
One quality every educator should have.
Empathy.
Best advice you've ever received.
I've said this too, that connection is key. Connection over discipline.
Book you'd recommend.
Oh, Finding Junie Kim.
Who's the author?
It's Ellen O.
What's bringing you joy right now?
Ooh, right now, so my son is with his dad over the summer. I get to see him this weekend. So, very excited to have him back.
What gives you hope for the future?
I would say the level of optimism that my son has gives me hope because there are moments where I feel like I come at life from a glass half empty perspective.
Grace, thank you so much for sharing your family story with such an honesty, courage, and vulnerability.
Thank you.
As we wrap up today's conversation with Grace Lee, I keep coming back to one idea. When neurodivergent children are misunderstood, systems can escalate this stress instead of supporting regulation. What stood out to me wasn't just the information. It was the reminder that behavior is communication and systems need curiosity before punishment. Because this work, whether we're talking about neurodiversity, disability, ethics, education, family systems, or school culture, isn't abstract. It's lived. It shows up in how we design systems, how we respond to children in distress, how we speak about behavior, what we assume is defiance. and what we're willing to question. If there's one takeaway I hope you carry with you, it's this. Look beyond the behavior and ask what support is missing. For those of you who identify personally with today's topic, whether as neurodivergent, disabled, parents, caregivers, educators, clinicians, or advocates, I hope this episode felt affirming. Your experience is real. Your voice matters. And cultural growth takes time. For those listening from a position of professional responsibility or relative privilege, maybe the invitation is slightly different. Pause. Reflect. Notice your lens. Before labeling a child as difficult, defiant, or disruptive, ask what might be happening beneath the surface. Ask whether the environment is supporting regulation or increasing distress. Ask whether the system is responding with care or simply reacting with control. Growth doesn't require perfection. It requires awareness. And awareness practiced daily becomes change. We don't move culture forward through outrage alone. We move it forward through conversation, through humility, through staying in the room. So wherever you're listening from today, thank you. Thank you for choosing nuance. Thank you for choosing reflection. Thank you for choosing to keep building. This is the Neurodiversity Voices Podcast, and we'll continue the conversation next time.